St. Louis in the late 19th century presents itself in municipal histories as a city in confident ascent. Rail lines multiplied, brick districts spread outward, river commerce thickened, the docks with activity. The record describes grading projects, widened boulevards, ambitious rebuilding after fires. All of it sounds orderly, progressive, measured. What unsettles me are the margins of that story. Along several downtown corridors, storefront windows sit half-buried beneath modern pavement, their upper frames aligned not with pedestrians but with the knees of those passing overhead. Stairways descend into what should be basements yet open onto intact commercial facades. Archival photographs show entire blocks resting lower than the streets now threading between them. The camera angles are flat, unremarkable. Nothing about them signals catastrophe. And yet the elevations do not agree with what the timelines insist. I began comparing construction dates against brick courses, door heights, foundation cuts. The materials correspond to surface-era buildings, but their placement does not. City ledgers remain tidy, permits lobbed in precise columns, survey sheets stamped and filed. Still, between those pages, measurements drift. Elevations shift without explanation. Anonymous surveyors disagree by feet, not inches. At first, it reads like routine urban chaos, clerical error, successive renovations. Then the patterns repeat, and the ground beneath St. Louis starts to feel less like foundation and more like something placed there after the fact. The next layer of the record waits in municipal archives and insurance offices, in oversized atlases bound with brittle cloth, and engineering diagrams folded into drawers that no longer close properly. Fire insurance maps become the first point of comparison. Addition follows addition, sometimes separated by only a few years. Building footprints remain fixed, property lines hold steady, but street elevations drift. In one printing, a row of commercial structures sits flush with the roadway. In the next, the same facades appear sunken, staircases penciled in where sidewalks once met thresholds. Basements become storefronts without permits noting demolition or reconstruction. Drainage channels shift downward, yet foundations stay intact. I begin cross-referencing ledger books. Page numbers are neat, dates align, stamps repeat in identical purple ink, clerks initial the margins with practiced loops. Archivists certify copies decades later, planning offices catalog revisions without commentary. Nothing looks chaotic. What refuses to behave is the geography. Entire blocks across separate wards register the same quiet transformation. Not renovations, not isolated grading projects, a city-wide adjustment that leaves no proportional paper trail. I slow down, remeasure scales, confirm north arrows, overlay grids by hand. The pattern survives every check. Somewhere between editions, St. Louis lowers itself, and nobody seems to have written down how. The paper record only carries the story so far. What comes next is physical. Excavations in older commercial districts expose brickwork several feet below current street grade. Entire facades preserved behind packed earth. Arched doorways open into sealed corridors. Window frames retain iron fittings. Gaslight fixtures still cling to walls that were never meant to become foundations. The masonry is uniform, courses laid cleanly, mortar joints narrow and consistent with surface-era construction. What unsettles is not decay but preservation. Municipal explanations describe routine filling projects, infrastructure upgrades, incremental raising of roadbeds to manage drainage. Yet the exposed interiors resist that narrative. Floorboards remain level, thresholds align with long-buried sidewalks. There is no scatter of demolition rubble, no shattered storefront glass compacted into soil layers, no evidence of gradual abandonment. The spaces appear closed over while still intact. Anonymous construction crews surface only through brief notations in inspection logs. Dates are present, descriptions stop short. Municipal inspectors record measurements, sign their names, and move on. In several cases, follow-up pages are missing entirely. I trace brick stamps to manufacturers active in the 1870s and 1880s. The tooling marks match surface buildings nearby. door heights conformed to commercial standards of the period. Everything belongs to the era. Nothing belongs to its depth. The absence becomes louder than the structures themselves. These rooms were not dismantled. They were covered, and whoever did it left the interiors behind. Once the buried rooms come into view, the question shifts downward, not into architecture, but into the ground itself. Engineering surveys begin to matter more than photographs. Bore logs taken during sewer upgrades list compacted layers several feet thick, resting directly against brick walls that were never designed to be subterranean. Geological notes describe fine-grained sediments consistent with river material, yet the distribution is wrong. Instead of tapering off, the layers remain uniform across entire blocks, packed tight enough to require mechanical removal. I compare those profiles to floodplain deposits along the Mississippi. Natural inundations leave uneven signatures, channels cut diagonally, debris scatters, organic matter streaks through silt in irregular bands. What sits beneath downtown St. Louis is cleaner than that, thicker, repetitive. River authorities appear only through typed memoranda and stamped tables. Drainage commissions file projections about levee heights and runoff management. One report attributes fill to grading operations. Another notes no such work during the same year. Measurements conflict, terminology shifts, volumes change between drafts. The contradictions stack quietly. If streets were raised gradually, the soil should tell a layered story. If flooding did the work, erosion should betray the current. Instead, the deposits read as if they arrived all at once, and whatever settled over those storefronts did not behave like routine river overflow. The next step leads upward again, away from soil samples and buried storefronts, back into climate-controlled galleries and municipal reading rooms where the story of the city is presented as settled. Plaques describe street-raising initiatives after major floods. Academic summaries refer to modernization campaigns, drainage improvements, the steady engineering work required to civilize a riverfront and metropolis. The phrasing is consistent, incremental, practical. Entire districts are said to have been lifted through coordinated infill programs carried out across decades. The language is careful. Elevations were adjusted, infrastructure upgraded, commercial basements repurposed. I trace the citations backward. Some led to engineering bulletins that list volumes of imported earth without specifying origin points. Others reference planning initiatives that appear years after photographs already show lowered facades. Several documents simply cite one another, looping in a closed circuit of reassurance. What does not appear is as striking as what does. No debate transcripts, no emergency appropriations, no sudden labor mobilizations, no contemporaneous newspaper campaigns describing the disruption of burying entire neighborhoods. No demolition contracts large enough to account for intact interiors now sealed beneath stone. The narrative is confident. The record supporting it is thin. When institutions speak through labels and summaries, the tone remains steady, almost soothing. The physical evidence underneath the streets does not share that composure. Between the two, a quiet space opens, and it keeps widening. Once the local record begins to thin, comparison becomes unavoidable. I widen the search outward into 19th century engineering journals, trade circulars, municipal dig reports published in regional newspapers. River cities recur: Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Kansas City, Memphis. In each case, short notices mention storefronts discovered below current pavement, drainage tunnels intersecting sealed doorways, sidewalks poured above earlier cornices. The language is procedural, unadorned, almost bored. Elevation adjustments, street improvement works, subgrade clearance. Railroad companies surface through requisition orders for ballast that exceed track requirements. River commissions log dredging volumes that do not correspond neatly to channel deepening. Municipal boards approve grading projects without accompanying diagrams. The signatures repeat, the circumstances echo. Basements become ground floors between editions of city atlases. Stone thresholds align across blocks at depths too consistent to be random. Brickwork, buried with windows intact, appears in cities separated by hundreds of miles, all along major waterways. I resist drawing lines too early. Parallel does not mean coordinated. Similar outcomes can arise from separate decisions made under similar pressures. But the timing clusters, the techniques match, the documentation thins in the same places. Across multiple cities, the pattern holds. Intact structures sealed, streets raised, explanations shortened, records smoothed into summaries years after the fact. St. Louis no longer feels isolated. It feels representative, and that realization alters the weight of what sits beneath those streets, turning a single district into a reference point for something that extends far beyond municipal boundaries. With patterns established across cities, I return to the paperwork that should anchor them in time. Permit ledgers thin abruptly in the years when streets appear to rise. Survey notebooks referenced in later summaries are no longer attached to their files. Minutes from municipal committees skip from proposal to completion without detailing interim operations. Entire sections of administrative memory vanish between volumes, leaving page numbers intact, but content absent. The clerks exist only through initials at the bottom of forms. Archivists appear through catalogue stamps dated decades after the events they describe. Committees leave behind resolutions without attachments, approvals without engineering schematics, budgets without breakdowns of labor or material origin. I begin listing what should exist: contract awards for earthmoving on a district scale, disposal records for demolished facades, transportation manifests for millions of cubic yards of fill, emergency appropriations, public hearings, newspaper debates over weeks of disrupted commerce. Instead, the trail narrows. In several cases, later documents acknowledge earlier surveys, then cite them again without reproducing them. References multiply, while the originals recede. The process seems to unfold entirely inside secondary accounts, never in the contemporaneous voice one would expect for work of that magnitude. Silence becomes cumulative, not one missing file, hundreds. The effect is subtle at first, then difficult to ignore. Whole operations appear to have occurred without procedural footprints. Infrastructure moved, districts altered, streets elevated. The paper that should have recorded it all dissolves into margins, and the absence begins to feel deliberate, not in motive, but in consistency. Whatever reshaped these cities did not leave behind the kind of trail large civic projects usually cannot avoid. That realization lingers, heavier than any single buried storefront, because systems forget in patterns too. By this point, the evidence forces a question I avoided asking at the beginning. Not who did this, but how quickly it could have happened. I step away from archives and into constraints. Volumes of sediment required to bury entire districts to uniform depths. Time frames implied by intact interiors. The absence of erosion along brick faces. The way gas fixtures and thresholds sit as though abandonment and coverage occurred close together rather than across generations. Engineering limits narrow the field. Moving that quantity of material gradually would demand years of traffic disruption, labor records, equipment procurement, visible staging grounds along riverbanks. A sudden influx would require hydraulic surges, extraordinary flood behavior, or coordinated emergency response on a scale that should dominate contemporary reporting. Hydrological models offer boundaries rather than answers. Known floods leave chaotic signatures, layered scouring, irregular deposition. What appears beneath these streets looks managed, even if the mechanism remains uncertain, dense, repeated, horizontally consistent. I test the scenario cautiously, watching which facts resist it. Fewer than resist the official account. To cover functioning buildings intact, without structural collapse, without prolonged abandonment, would demand either deliberate sealing or an event so overwhelming that recovery efforts would reshape civic life for life. Years. Either path implies mobilization, and mobilization implies records, which returns me to the same absence. Not dramatic proclamations, not accusations, just a growing alignment between what would have been required and what cannot now be located. The hypothesis remains provisional, but its ability to absorb anomalies, while conventional explanations fracture, changes the balance of the inquiry. Something about these cities suggests interruption rather than renovation, and whatever that interruption was, it left behind architecture frozen in place, soil without a gradual story, and institutions whose documentation grows quieter exactly where scale should have made silence impossible. The investigation no longer rests solely in soil profiles or filing cabinets. It begins to drift into something less measurable. Cities change faster than their residents notice. Streets widen, transit corridors carve new paths, buildings disappear behind scaffolding and reappear wearing different dates. Maps compress decades into neat color blocks. Plaques condense complexity into paragraphs that fit beneath glass. I trace how memory is constructed after disruption rather than during it. Redevelopment projects favor forward momentum. Planners prioritize utility over archaeology. Historians inherit whatever documentation survives long enough to be catalogued. Each generation accepts the framework it is given, rarely questioning foundations, unless something protrudes far enough into the present to demand attention. Basement windows do that. Buried cornices do that. Doorways opening into earth do that. But only briefly. Once utilities reroute and sidewalks are repoured, anomalies recede into service tunnels and maintenance shafts. Contractors work around them. Engineers note them in margins. Tall brochures omit them. The city resumes its surface rhythm. Forgetting does not require conspiracy. It requires replacement. New pavements layered over old grades. New narratives built atop provisional explanations. Archives reorganized under modern classifications that separate geology from architecture, engineering from social history, floods from zoning from demolition permits. What falls between those categories becomes difficult to see. Populations adapt, officials summarize, scholars cite earlier summaries. Over time, the story simplifies, not because anyone demanded it, because complexity is expensive to preserve. Standing beneath modern streets, surrounded by rooms that should have been demolished, but were instead sealed, the pattern feels less like erasure through force and more like disappearance through momentum. A civilization does not need to destroy its own past. It only needs to keep building and allow whatever lies underneath to fade into technical notes, footpaths, and inherited assumptions. The structures remain, the questions soften. Until someone begins measuring again, I return to the present. Traffic moves across avenues that did not exist when the lower storefronts were built. Delivery trucks idle above sealed arches. Office workers pass over cornices that once framed windows at eye level. The city performs its ordinary rhythms, while an earlier version of itself remains suspended beneath concrete and asphalt. Using the measurements gathered along the way, I trace outlines on contemporary maps. Blocks align, doorways cluster. Elevation shifts follow, corridors that once hosted commerce. Geological layers settle exactly where archival silence begins. Engineering summaries drift away from physical reality. No single anomaly dominates. It is their agreement that persists. The institutions encountered throughout this inquiry remain in place, not obstructive, not hostile, simply distant. Their records speak fluently until scale intrudes, then thin into abstracts and footnotes. Their histories remain confident, while the ground beneath those histories tells a quieter story. Nothing resolves. No missing ledger reappears. No report surfaces that accounts for uniform sediment, intact interiors, synchronized elevation changes across cities. The investigation closes the way it began. With surfaces that refuse to explain what supports them, I walk those streets knowing what sits below. Rooms sealed with fixtures still mounted. walls pressed against packed river silt, foundations that do not align with the dates carved into plaques above them. The pavement holds, the buildings above continue to rise, and somewhere beneath the daily commerce of St. Louis, another city waits, preserved in shadow, measured but not understood, its existence neither confirmed nor erased, only covered, only quiet, still there,